What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? My name's Austin, and we are back with actually a brand new show. And we're dubbing this, or I think we're dubbing this, Strategy Sessions with Tom, which is we're taking a little bit of a departure from the tech talks, and we're getting under the hood, discussing some of the things that you may not be privy to in the community. And I know that when you guys watch these videos, you kind of do it with, you kind of go through it with a little fine tooth comb, seeing if you can yank out the nuggets that maybe we're not going to talk about in the chats. And this is going to be one giant boulder of a nugget. Tom, thank you so much for joining me, man.
Yeah, I think with respect to the strategy sessions versus the tech talks, a lot of my role in everything that we're doing, across Devio, Dev Digital Forever, and our interactions there, really is setting a lot of the kind of high level strategy of where we're going. So, thought it would be good to kind of share, some of the implications of our strategy and strategic thinking with the community.
That would be wonderful. And so, all right, to kick us off, I think where we want to go is we have there's a very unique liquidity mechanism that is underpinning Dev Exchange that is completely novel and created by you and the team over at Devio. And I'm wondering if we can dive into that a little bit, because I think when folks really start to understand the mechanics underlying what's coming forth with Dev Exchange, it's going to be, to use my own phrase, head will roll off of your shoulders onto the floor once you really see what's coming.
Yeah. I think this is a great inaugural strategy sessions discussion, because this is one of the coolest things we've been working on. One of the things I've been most looking forward to the community learning about. I think people are going to be stoked about it. It really ties in with the utility of Devi and Fios and what we're doing there. And so it's one of the areas that I think people have been most wanting to learn more. And we're finally at a point where we're ready to share everything, got patents submitted. We're on the timeline of our marketing, disclosures and everything we're putting out. So it's time to go through it and share it with everybody what we've been cooking for a while. So
absolutely beautiful. And so we've been talking about, some of the things they do know about contingent transaction sets, right? Mathematically instant settlement. We've talked about the removal of counterparty risk, but I do know that there's a faction of our community that thinks, okay, well, this is just the same kind of output that we're used to in crypto. Because and I really want us on this podcast, if we could, to show precisely why this is something completely new and completely different from all of that. And so we've got new terms that you guys may not know yet: liquidity cache, liquidity mesh. Can we dive into what those are and maybe some of the functionality and I'll just let you run with it, because I know there's a lot there.
yeah, totally. So let's take one step back and kind of look at the big picture of what this kind of represents. So if you go back 8 or 9 years, we came up with the invention of the sharding, implementation. And so parallelizing, different blockchains where each blockchain can be customized to a particular use case, right? So that was one of our really important inventions. And then if you go back 2 or 3 years ago, we came up with the contingent transaction sets. And the contingent transaction sets really enable, any two parties to exchange assets without a middleman and have mathematically instantaneous settlement. So another really important invention that's led to, developing the exchange. And similarly, if you go way back to the beginning, we had the fraud protections and loss protections, and all these pieces are kind of coming together. I think this is one of the last big pieces to really make the whole business go. It's an overall liquidity provisioning system that underlies the exchange. And that's one of the biggest challenges with an exchange, is making sure you have enough liquidity. But the technical innovation that goes into this, and kind of the business processes that people are going to be excited about. The way I think about it, just kind of leading in the conversation, I think this is the first time where you're really building an exchange that you're sharing in the growth with the community and with everybody that gets involved early. Exchanges just, in the crypto space, just make so much money. And I think we can grow the de facto exchange, the new gold standard, the new leader in the space, by being regulatory compliant, by doing things that others don't with contingent transaction sets, and by growing with the community and having really this become the go-to place for liquidity, both for using it and for making money off of the use of your liquidity for assets that you hold. So Let me kind of go in and describe what it is now that I've kind of set the stage a little bit. I'll share I'll share a diagram that's actually from the patent.
And now, just to be clear, I know you had mentioned one patent in the chats. Is this a separate patent? Do you have multiple patent applications going currently?
Yeah, so we've submitted a bunch of new patents, and we've got our original old patents: the fraud, theft, loss, the privacy solution, the sharding solution itself. More recently, we've got the contingent transaction sets, and then this is one of the big patents we've submitted that talks about the liquidity provisioning system, and the exchange system that ties in the liquidity with a digital asset exchange. But it also describes just how the system works as a whole, where you can even have things like lending tied in with contribution. So we'll get into all that. Okay.
Amazing, amazing.
So you're able to see this diagram.
We are
Okay.
there.
So yeah, so it's a very, very kind of just simplistic diagram. This is the kind of this is from the patent, right? So this is the kind of thing that you put in patents, just kind of these block diagrams. But overall, what you have is a collection of liquidity caches. So liquidity cache is kind of like a mix between a liquidity pool and single-sided liquidity, but it's not either, right? We needed our own name for the concept. And the concept really is very powerful because it's automated, it's integrated directly, it's run at the validator level. I'll get into that a little bit more as well. But fundamentally, you have this collection of many different liquidity caches, and each liquidity cache typically has a primary digital asset and a shared digital asset. So you would have, for example, a Bitcoin Devi liquidity cache, and then you'd have an ETH Devi liquidity cache, and then all the way up to thousands of tokens and Devi. And you can use these to convert instantly between different types of assets. So if you wanted to buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks with Bitcoin, you could use the payment side of this. Have a transaction, that's maybe a scan of a QR code at the retailer, come into the have Bitcoin would be sent to the Bitcoin Devi liquidity cache. Then Devi would be taken out of that. That Devi would then go into a USDC, for example, and Devi liquidity cache, which would then kind of export USDC, and then that can be sent to the merchant. So you end up with 3 transactions that all go into one contingent transaction set, integrated with these liquidity caches that really let you instantly transfer any asset into any other asset. And I'll get into kind of the business model around these liquidity caches, because that's the most exciting thing to me is really the business model around it. But what that ends up being then, and we've said this before, is that lets you create use Devi as the money of money. And then you could similarly have, fiat being used with different types of metaverse or social tokens, things like that. And then you could have a Devi and fiat liquidity cache as well, that you could take these groupings with shared digital assets, and convert, between them. Then the other thing you'll notice is this entire collection of liquidity caches and all of this liquidity, between the primary digital assets and the shared digital assets. All of this ties in not just with the payment system, it ties in with the exchange as well. And the exchange is run, through a regular order book. And so you have these primary digital assets that are running with the exchange as kind of assets that are used for market making and creating liquidity on the exchange as well. So then you have a payment system, an exchange system, an entire mesh of liquidity caches that's creates all the liquidity, and that overall system is what we've been referring to, at least in the patent, as an asset exchange system, right? So it's got all of these components, and that includes then the theft protections, the loss protections, the privacy solution, the bailment approach for wrap tokens, all of it integrated together into one system that all works together. So this has never been done before. This type of architecture and system is very fast. It's very efficient. we'll get into some of the real details about why this is so different from anything else out there, and the real ramifications of what it all means. So.
Oh, I have questions. I have questions. Okay. So on the diagram, there was something there named liquidity C, and it just said Devi in that box. What is the liquidity C?
So a lot of how the system works is, implementing balancing, right? If you're a market maker, you have to balance your assets. A market making, you can take positions, and if there's a lot of volatility, you can find yourself in a position where you have more or less of something that you want or don't want, and you can lose money, right? So market makers have their algorithms, and it's a proven, tried and true business model. But you have to run the algorithms in kind of the right way to make sure you're making money through the market making activities, making money across the spread, for example. And so there's these balancing concepts, and then you also have similarly, the need to use, for immediate payments, the more liquidity pool aspect of what liquidity caches are, and then that can become disbalanced as well. And so especially with Devi in particular, we have it where different amounts of Devi can go into the liquidity cache to balance the whole thing. And then and that comes from the liquidity C. So it's kind of a balancing mechanism, but it's also kind of, I would say, a monetary system where overall, again, as I said at the beginning, we're taking the fees and revenues that the whole system makes and sharing it with the community for the use of their assets in creating liquidity, right? And so the way that we do that is people can contribute to the liquidity C, and then that gets distributed into the liquidity caches for Devi. And we have a lending concept as well, that the lending concept can be, you can borrow against your Devi after it's contributed, right? So and we'll get into that more, but that ties in with the liquidity Cs as well. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but the liquidity Cs then let you contribute, share in the upside of the exchange. And that's huge, right? Again, that's massive. And because of the way the system is implemented, the way all of this is run at the validator level, create a borrowing and lending system, that you could still maintain access to the use of those underlying assets. So.
I'm gonna get wrinkles because you got me smiling so much while you describe that. So I want to bring you back to, all right. So you had mentioned providing. Well, let me ask you this first. So the overall liquidity for the whole system, right? Devi plus the other assets, where is that coming from?
We're going to have a system where users or community can contribute into these liquidity caches. And so for example, with the Bitcoin Devi liquidity cache, people will be able to contribute Bitcoin into it. And then the Bitcoin will be used for market making. And then that market making activities, and again, a proven business model, this is established, and it's tied directly in with the exchange, right? So we have control over how it's going to work. For example, there's market makers that kind of famously pay Robinhood, to get access to deal flow. Well, we have all of that deal flow, right? So liquidity caches are going to be a valuable place to be able to make revenue on market making. And then from the exchange's point of view, it's also a great place to, take market making activities, help remove volatility, help make sure that the markets are made during times of higher volatility. So all the stuff that market makers do. And so people will be able to contribute, their assets that are the primary digital asset for any given liquidity cache, and share in those market making fees. And then people will also be able to contribute Devi, for example, or Fias for the Fias liquidity caches, and then share in revenue there. And I'll get into that in more detail, later. But then, you also could, for example, raise money. This is one of the things I've been talking with Will Stewart about, for example. And there's a lot of people in more the TradFi space that want to make money, particularly, on the assets and money that they have, and they're not interested in investing it into. There's a lot of investors that aren't interested in investing into stock. They're not interested in taking that big risk to get the big upside. They just want to put their money into something fairly safe that produces a nice percentage income. And so what we could do is put together, just investment vehicles where people could invest into it, use that to buy Bitcoin or other assets, Will has described that he has networks of investors that are interested in this kind of thing, and then we could build out more and more liquidity caches that fulfill the liquidity in the whole system. And one important thing to think about too is the overall context of everywhere where Dev Digital is going, where Devio is going, where Forever is going, where we're all going is this broad tokenization concept and how we're going to you know be really the go-to platform we feel for tokenizing the world's assets. So all of these concepts, you could create liquidity caches across, any type of asset. Could be, fractionalized real estate or whatever, and we could have investment vehicles like SPVs, special purpose vehicles that bring in investments to buy lots of other different types of assets, and it could range across, environmental assets, carbon credits, again, real world assets like fractionalized real estate, but it could, get in ultimately as regulations allow stocks and bonds, things like that too. So this concept works with any type of asset and can create liquidity for any type of asset. And the vision of where we're going is we want to become the world's primary source for liquidity. Because again, we're sharing it with everybody that's contributing. You can put your assets into it. We have protections that make it the place to put your assets from a safety point of view. It'll be the place to put your assets from kind of a revenue point of view. And liquidity begets more liquidity. With more liquidity, there's more trades. With more trades, there's more liquidity, and the whole thing snowballs in that sense too. So it's a really big vision of kind of what we're overall building.
Now, I want to ask you, just coming from a DeFi background myself, the obvious DeFi elephant in the room that is a big prevention for a lot of people wanting to provide their assets is impermanent loss, which for anyone that doesn't know what that is, when you go into any type of, traditional AMM liquidity pool, when there's a delta, between, let's say one asset runs 400% and the other one goes 5%, over time, what ends up happening is through the rebalancing of the pool, you end up with less than you would have ended up with had you just held the assets individually without providing liquidity. And so a lot of the time, the returns for providing the liquidity on occasion doesn't outpace what the IL is. And so, it kind of makes it not something to do in traditional DeFi. And I'm wondering with folks that want to provide, if we're talking about big players that want to provide big amounts of liquidity, how does our infrastructure mitigate against that?
Yeah. So liquidity caches aren't just operating as liquidity pools. So the exchange itself has an order book, and there's a spread on the order book between the bids and the asks. And
Mm-hmm.
there's traditional market makers that will work with as well. We've been having great conversations with those as well. And so when you're using the primary digital asset for market making, again, it's implementing that in traditional ways. It's there's an automated market making system that really acts as a traditional market maker, creating limit orders in the order book. And that's different than an AMM, in a DEX, automated market maker in a DEX. So those just work off of you multiply the amount of each token, the K value, and that K value remains constant. And that mathematical function can lead to impermanent loss, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
So in our case, for the immediate payments, you have a similar type of mechanism. And you don't always want to use a K value. Like there's different kinds of functions that you can use, mathematical functions that provide more stability in different ranges, that kind of thing. But either way, the other thing that's kind of neat about this system is the whole thing really works together. And so you have rebalancing concepts both for the exchange and for the immediate payment kind of concepts. So if a liquidity pool gets if the liquidity pool kind of types of operations in the liquidity cache get disbalanced, you can buy and sell from the exchange to rebalance it. And overall, you have the fees tied in with some of the how it gets maybe disbalanced. Where if it starts to get disbalanced, then there's more pressure for a particular type of asset, which happens in markets, right? Then the fees naturally go up from that K value, but you could then rebalance later, and you make more money, which some of that money goes back towards rebalancing. But the math of the whole thing works that there's a lot of money to be made on the market making, on the exchange fees, on the payments fees, right? And all of it is, because it's integrated, it all can be rebalanced. So you can manage the risks around, what you typically run into with the DEX. Another thing that I'll also point out is, because we're managing the entire system, and because we're doing it with contingent transaction sets, because we're implementing things, in a way that you don't have a lot of, MEV type of possibilities. You can also prevent, even, kind of TradFi concepts like, naked short selling, right? All of the system and the way it's implemented, you can remove a lot of the shenanigans that happen in, traditional trading systems. From a TradFi point of view, you can automate and create requirements in smart contracts and even lower level, validator programming, that again removes things like, types of manipulation and naked short selling, things like that. And then on the DeFi side of things, you can prevent front running, and you can prevent front running, other types of front running in TradFi too. But particularly in, kind of block ordering and the DEX types of, front running, you could prevent a lot of those types of shenanigans. So overall, you have a system that's a lot more efficient. It's also very cost effective. It's very fast, right? So you just have a system that's overall a lot more efficient, and all of the efficiencies that we create and the removal of all of those shenanigans go to, the users, right? It just makes the whole ecosystem much more efficient.
Beautiful. All right. So, and I'll have to rewatch that. I will most definitely have to rewatch that to absorb everything you just said. But I want to move us forward because, and for anyone watching, flash the diagram in your head. So we had the primary digital asset, which was like your Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. And then we had our secondary digital asset, which was always Devi. And then we talked about the liquidity C. And as we were talking, you did mention, okay, we could provide liquidity in Devi, which is, I would dub it single-sided liquidity. And that Devi is essentially used, with the exception of, social tokens or metaverse tokens for fiat, but that Devi is essentially used in every single liquidity cache. And so in my mind, I'm likening this to, obviously technologically it's very different, but if Uniswap, had every pair on ETH, which a lot of them they do, and you could provide single-sided Ethereum and avail of, some sort of LP fees as a result of every trade on the system, that is fairly significant. And I'm please poke holes in what I just said, because it does it sounds way up there. And I'm wondering if you could dive a little bit deeper into that for me, Tom.
Sure. Yeah. So I wouldn't probably think of Devi as single-sided liquidity. I think of it more as just matching against all of the other, assets in there. So again, this is part of where I think we're different from what else is out there. Is, again, the immediacy, the low cost, but the way all of these interact together, the way that you can use both the payment system and the exchange system, to rebalance each other. But what Devi ends up being then is the currency for currency. You can instantly, transfer or exchange any asset for any other asset. And that's huge, especially when you start getting into, tokenized assets and many other types of assets. Like if you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different types of assets, it's hard to have a trading pair on a traditional exchange with all of those assets. But Devi can be used to exchange between all those assets. That's why we call it the money of money. And then the other big thing that's kind of different from what we do with, what else is out there is, again, the integration of the whole system. So let me take a step back and describe, a little bit of how we implement, our programming of these concepts in contrast to smart contracts. So we use a concept internally that we call monads. And so a monad is a lower level implementation of what other exchanges do with smart contracts. And you need it at the actual kind of validator programmed level to implement a number of the things that we do. So for example, we have our loss protections, right? Where you have your assets in your wallet, you put an NFT that represents the loss protection implementation. That NFT can't be deleted or moved, right? Because it's specially recognized by the validators through the monad system, right? And so then if you lose your private key, the NFT defines recourse. So for example, it can define other, addresses that you could sign a recovery transaction with, and then it gets transferred over to a new wallet, and you have recourse. But if somebody tried to abuse that system, and then they wanted to steal using the loss recovery, well, it's held there for 30 days, and then you can reverse the transaction with the original private key. So you have recourse for loss, but no actual trust, because if you didn't actually lose it, then people can't abuse it and you can reverse the transaction, right? So I love our loss protection concept. It's very, very simple, but solves a huge problem in the crypto space. So the reason I kind of went through that again, and we've talked about that in past discussions, is, we're implementing it with monads, and monads are that low level programming that is, monads implement, the loss recovery transaction, and you can't do that with a smart contract, because you're doing things at a lower level that creates protections and security that's just impossible to implement, with a layer above where the validators are operating. And so we also implement the theft protections at the monad level. We implement the contingent transaction sets. We implement the orders that go into the order book on the exchange. And then we also implement the lending, solution. So lending is a really important part of what we're doing as well. So let's say you contribute Devi into the liquidity C or into a particular liquidity cache. Devi then is used for the immediate payments, for example. There's fees that we collect off of that. Those fees are then shared with the Devi holders. And so it's a great place to hold your Devi because you make fees on the overall, exchange ecosystem. But then, let's say you want to protect it where, you have it where, if it gets transferred out to somebody else, somebody hacks into your system and steals your private key and transfers it, you can add a theft protection NFT. And then similarly, you could say, well, what if I want access? I've contributed my Devi to the system. I'm making money off of it. What if I want access to the value underlying that? And you could, for example, take a loan on that Devi, and that's where the liquidity ocean comes in, right? So the liquidity ocean is unowned Devi that swaps out for Devi that's being used by a user for the loan. And so you have this big pool of unowned liquidity, that nobody will ever sell for for upside, including Forever and Devio and Dev Digital. And so you just have a system that's all integrated where you can contribute your Devi, make money off of it, get a loan off of the underlying asset, and then use the value of that loan, outside of it. Outside of the system. And so overall, you have all of these pieces seamlessly working together at the very low level validator level using monads. And nobody else has built a system anywhere near what this is, right? So the end result then is it becomes the go-to place to keep your assets, right? They're protected, you can make money off of them, and you can use the value underlying them all at the same time, right? So it's just a huge concept, a new concept in general for the crypto space and the TradFi space.
I have to probe you a little bit on the lending, because this really is, icing on the cake here. And so, in traditional DeFi lending, I think a lot of people are familiar with this. You provide your assets on the supply side, and you have the ability to borrow at a certain, loan to value ratio on the other side, whether it's 70%, 80%, depending on the asset being put up as collateral. And I was asking you kind of before we started this, how the loans work. And you had a really interesting answer that I was not expecting. And would you mind sharing with us a little bit more on the loans specifically and how we're kind of integrating something that hasn't been done before?
Yeah. So the lending system is another part of the overall patent that we put out. I think it's very innovative itself. It has some very powerful kind of implementations and mechanics, that are again implemented at the monad level. And so before I get to what you were kind of teasing, let me explain a little bit of again some of the dynamics. So let's look at our theft solution, right? So if you have a theft, kind of lock up in your wallet, there's a theft NFT that defines those characteristics. And what it can do, for example, is say assets coming out of this wallet, can only be used after 30 days, right? So it's a 30-day lockup. And there's different ways you can implement it, and some of the different ways you might want to implement it can have different tax ramifications. So that's another of the big concepts that we've been developing, is how you implement all of these things in different ways so that it's perceived more beneficially from a tax perspective, right? So let's say you implement your theft protection as the assets don't leave my wallet for 30 days, right? And then there's therefore no tax. It's not like putting it into escrow, where you could have a tax consequence and where somebody else is in control of it. Like you're in full control of it, and it doesn't leave your wallet, right? So this would have solved the Bybit hack if they were maintaining assets that were on the DevX blockchain. They could put theft protections on. People believe it's the North Koreans that stole $1.5 billion worth of ETH, right? And so if it had theft protections, it would have been triggered that it was to be sent, but then it would have been caught before it was sent, and the transaction would have been reversed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it works well as a theft protection solution, and there's recourse for theft if somebody steals your private key. All right, now the other side of that solution then as well, what you're doing then is if you have theft protection, then an asset that's getting sent over, um, you can't use it for that time period, and it doesn't actually get received, and so that you don't credit the payment. So if you're buying something, you can't you really can't use those assets for 30 days. Well, what you could do then instead is you can borrow off of these assets that are theft protected, and then you can get access to the funds underlying them. And so you have the best of both worlds. Theft is protected, but you have access to the underlying funds. Really compelling concept. Okay, so then what the question you tease, that where do you get those funds? You could get it from a traditional banking institution, for example. So a traditional bank can lend against it, and they could lend U.S. dollars or euros against Bitcoin, for example, and they probably will have a ratio, given potential volatility. But in a lot of cases, like in that theft example, you lock up Bitcoin, and then you want access to the Bitcoin early. The bank can lend Bitcoin against your Bitcoin, and then it's 1-to-1, and there's no risk from the bank's point of view. And if there's no risk and it's just a matter of timing, then all you're really paying for as a consumer getting borrowing the assets, you're just paying for the conveniency of that timing, and that's not that expensive, right? And there's not a lot of there's no risk from the bank's point of view lending 1-to-1, and it's just a matter of time until you get the asset. If the loan isn't paid off, if it goes into default and you have to collect on the collateral, and so it just ends up being a nice solution. So then you have these really powerful lending mechanics that are implemented at the monad level, again at the validator level, that can tie in with our other systems like the theft protection. So let's jump into kind of really, to me, one of the main points of this whole strategy sessions is then how do people make money on it? Why does this create value for Devi? Why is this such an exciting thing for what Devi means? And to me, this overall system creates the most useful token in existence. This is more useful than ETH as gas. This is more useful than Bitcoin as a storage system. This creates an overall token system where you can use it to transfer any asset and any other asset. So it becomes the money of money. It therefore also becomes a very strong storage system. It also has mechanisms that let you borrow off of contributions where you're making revenue off of it, and it lets you share in the revenue of the overall growth of the exchange. And then the more these assets that go in, the more liquidity you have, the more the exchange grows, which creates more opportunity for bigger liquidity pools, which creates more revenue. And so all of it together just makes Devi, again, to me, the most useful token in history, right, in existence. So let's go through some of the specifics on it, right? Beyond those broad statements. So you contribute. A good example situation is you contribute Devi into the Devi C, and it gets distributed into these Devi liquidity caches, and then you have others that contribute Bitcoin and ETH and other tokens and other real world assets into these liquidity caches. So again, let's go through the three types of revenue that you make from it. The primary digital assets make revenue off of the market making activities. Again, a tried and true, way of creating revenue that we control because we control the exchange and the order book. And all of this will be run through a separate entity called devise, because you want the exchange operating separately, but they're gonna be partnered well together. And so you make revenue off of the market making from the liquidity caches for both Devi and the primary digital assets. Then you also make money off of the exchange, and the exchange can make great revenue as exchanges do, right? And then you can make revenue off of the payment system, and the payment system can be not just payments in retail. It could be, again, anytime you want to immediately transfer, exchange any asset for another asset. So you could use it for remittance or arbitrage or whatever, right? So you have this overall system, and whenever Devi is used in that situation, you create fees off of it, right? So Devi will share in those revenues. Devi holders, when they contribute to the liquidity caches, will share in those revenues. You can borrow off of the Devi that's in the liquidity caches, and you can use your Devi to exchange for any other asset as well yourself, right? So that's kind of just a summary of the whole point, right? It just really makes Devi, I think the go-to token for especially where the world is moving in this global tokenization movement.
Amazing explanation. And so, okay, I want to touch on two things, and I know we're kind of getting to the end here, so I wanted to bring these up before I forget them. And the first is, up until this point, I know that everyone's kind of experienced this. Anyone that's tried to enter the market in size with the Devi token experiences, with slippage and things of that nature, because the liquidity is not deep on Uniswap and what have you. So it does sound like we're going to go from that scenario to a tremendous amount of liquidity for the Devi token. And the second thing that I wanted to ask about, I just wanted to kick us real quick back to the lending, because in the description that you were giving on taking a traditional loan against locked up assets, it almost sounded to me like, and I wanted to clarify, well, you'll have these assets locked, but you'll need to go find a bank that's willing to loan against it. And I wanted to clarify that, because is that the sort of deal, or is it the sort of deal where we're going to have banking partners waiting in the wings, wanting these loans because they know they're so secure and they're just excellent returns?
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of the areas I think I've seen the most interest in our partner discussions is lending, especially with the way that we can account for tax ramifications. And so we'll have it set up on our system where you have these sets of lenders, and you can just get a loan very easily. So everything we've built from the beginning, everything we're continuing to build is kind of a Web 2 interface philosophy, right? And that's another of the big changes between what we're doing with others, right? So the exchange is going to run like a centralized exchange, or really actually more like a TradFi, exchange, where you have an easy to use interface. Everything happens very quickly. It's regulatory compliant, all the things that you want to see in a very professionally large scale run exchange. And then the lending side of it will be in that same kind of interface where you'll go in and most of it will just be automated, right? The lenders, banks or other TradFi institutions can say these are the characteristics in which I'm going to lend. These are the pools of money we have for it. You can actually use the liquidity caches themselves to create some of the assets that are lent out to the borrowers, for example, as well. So all of it will be easy to use, seamless, regulatory compliant. It's all going to be very polished and professional, and it'll feel like a TradFi type of experience. But within that overall context of regulatory compliance and the TradFi smoothness, it's everything we do holds to not your keys, not your crypto, right? You can control your asset, and you could even have a hard wallet, a cold storage. So you plug a USB, hard wallet into your USB port, and through an interface, run your orders directly from that hard wallet. And so then you end up with no middleman at any point on all of these things from the kind of the user's point of view that you're running the exchange. So all of that is the exchange side of it that's sitting on top of this overall liquidity system.
Unbelievable. All right. So this was a really power packed chat that we just had. And I know that because there's so many concepts that have been not even maybe teased, but like the community doesn't know about 90% of what we just discussed. And it is really such a huge video. I can't wait for you guys to see this. But being that we're at roughly the 40-minute mark, or at least that's what mine says, is there anything that you wanted that we missed or that we need to touch on before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think I'll just emphasize again the overall business model. I think is what I was most excited to kind of describe
Mm-hmm.
today. And as you just said, I'm looking forward to our community seeing this. I'm also looking forward to the concepts really growing and spreading. You can imagine how this could be received by KOLs, how it can be received by TradFi institutions. Again, you could imagine where we bring in SPV investments, special purpose vehicle investments, to really grow this liquidity system. So the business model around it's great, and it really emphasizes the value of Devi and Fias, where you can contribute these, make money off of the use of them in a very low risk way, and then borrow off of those underlying assets. It's a use for a token that especially tied in with what we hope to become the first gold, the new gold standard for what exchanges are going to be. I think the sky is the limit. So I'm excited about what the business model around all this really implies.
Sky is the limit. I must agree with you, Tom. Tom, thank you so much, buddy. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. And so this is our first strategy session. I believe we are planning on having another one of these in about a month. Now, I want to put a little asterisk next to that. I can't say that word very well. That I'm going to, we're going to be welcoming a new baby girl into the world here pretty soon, myself and my wife. And so if that lands around the month mark, we may have to delay that a week or two. But other than that, plan on us being here in 30 days. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. My name's Austin. I'll catch you guys on the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.